afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm just going to talk to you very briefly, some overview slides about how to source in new regions and really how to optimise your sourcing strategy for profitability. So firstly, who are Retail 100 and what is our sourcing experience? So I'm 1/4 or 25% of Retail 100. So myself, Anna, Elaine and Neil founded the business about 3 years ago now, and we're called Retail 100 because at the time we had exactly 100 years of retail experience between us. So that was across buying and merchandising roles in department store retail. And during that time, we were really lucky to be able to have sourced from across the globe, across various categories. So anything from menswear in Italy to ceramics in Portugal to Christmas trees in China, you name it, we've probably sourced it over the years. So where to start? So in order to build a profitable sourcing strategy, there are loads of considerations and decisions you need to make. And as with lots of things in life, it's kind of really a lot about the preparation and the forward planning and the thinking before you launch into it. And before you start on your journey, this can be quite an overwhelming task, especially if you want to make more ethical and sustainable business decisions. So, in essence, you're in a great place. So Source Home and Gift is a great place to start. Excuse that slide. So it's got an old slide on there. It's come up, just slightly throw me. But it's a great place to start your research, as is Source Fashion, if you want to be sourcing in that area. So you can really kind of walk around, absorb the different stands, talk to people, because it's actually an amazing opportunity to really understand what manufacturers, artisans are out there, what regions things come from, and kind of how you can engage with that. But there are also some kind of sometimes simpler ways, some really easy ways to start thinking about what sourcing means to you. So if you're really keen on finding a product that you've seen elsewhere, you might have seen it in another retailer that you really like, you kind of start to look at really simple things like looking on products, because they all should now say made in. So when it's saying made in India, made in China, made in Portugal, it will start to give you clues to the sort of things you like, where they come from and where they're generally sourced. Again, it's a very simple, obvious thing to say, but search engines kind of, again, just Googling some thoughts around what you're looking for, what you want to source and where you might find it. LinkedIn is another great resource, so kind of community, talking and putting it out there. You'd be amazed kind of people are willing to help, share experiences, share reassurance as well, because sometimes one of the most daunting things about sourcing is kind of where you need to find something and how to trust what you're looking at is coming from the right place. So really use that peer-to-peer support that's out there. So again, whilst you're here today, kind of conversations with people will really help you start to understand your sourcing journey. And then there is some really interesting other things out there. So kind of we always advocate some Instagram accounts that are quite interesting. So there are two different ones, Life of a Buyer and Life of a Merchandiser. They're always posting really interesting, relevant content to people sourcing. So that can be on both sides of the fence. So it can be for someone looking to source, or it can actually be for manufacturers and factories. There's often requests go up on the stories saying, I need to find a factory that produces woolen socks, for instance, or I need to find this. And likewise, you can ask for kind of requests to go up, and people really engage with that type of content because, again, it's that peer-to-peer, you're helping someone out, and it's a great way to do business. So today we're kind of going to more focus on the difference between near and far source countries. And some of these points are kind of generalised, so you will find exceptions to some of these, but in general, they're the sort of things that people expect from these different types of countries. So what do we mean by near source countries? So as it sounds, we're talking about countries that are closer to us. So typically for home and gift, they're generally located in Europe and areas like Turkey, but not to forget the UK as well. So there is a lot that comes closer to home. So the general rule, and again, as I say, you know, kind of artisan suppliers can buck this trend with fast source, but the factories can generally accommodate smaller volumes. that, as you would expect, being closer to home, there are quicker lead times with more flexible freight options. So especially kind of somewhere like Turkey is a realm of kind of different freight options, from shipping to road to air. So you can really have more flexibility. And certain materials and embellishments are often specialities. So again, the artisan element coming in, but historically things that have been produced in areas for a long time still remain. So kind of thinking about home and gifts, kind of some areas to pull out that are generally easier to find in near source countries are things like ceramics. So obviously there is still an element of ceramic production in the UK, but countries like Portugal and Italy and Spain are still producing a lot of ceramics. And in certain areas, certain techniques are seen as specialities. So if you're looking for reactive glazes, for instance, Portugal is particularly strong on those. And another kind of category that is something that predominates in near-source countries is something like home fragrance. So again, if you're looking to source candles, diffusers and the like, across the UK and Europe, there are a plethora of factories that can support you with that. So on the other side, what to expect from far shore countries. So when we talk far source, again, we're generally talking about countries located in Asia. And factories are often set up to produce higher volumes. So for a lot of retailers, this is where they produce their core volume programs. So if they want something in real bulk, so if we're talking about ceramics and it was a white porcelain range, which the retailer was selling in sets in volume, it was probably coming out of a far source country. Though generally, again, as I say, some of these are generalizations, but cheaper labor and material costs. But there are obviously longer lead times with a focus on sea freight. So in general, you're kind of talking about factoring in several months of lead time as opposed to talking in weeks, and sometimes with the nearshore countries. So as I say, kind of a general rule of thumb, but the most important thing when thinking about nearshore and far shore is how you work both of those in combination and what are the right options for your business. So this is where you kind of start to think about costings and margins and what's going to be right for making sourcing profitable for your business. So blended margin. So starting off with blended margin, and that's why we've talked about nearshore and far shore sourcing. So generally, blended margin wasn't something a lot of retailers looked at until global issues such as the pandemic were starting to happen, and things like when the Suez Canal problems started to impact shipping, they realised if everything was coming on boats from further afield, they were really prone to the issues that could present. So a lot of retailers then started looking at their nearshore options, and what they're trying to do by that is offset and manage risk. So when we talk about blended margin, what you're doing is kind of looking for a source, probably from a far shore country, that you know is going to be on a longer lead time, but probably offers you a higher margin, and then looking for a similar source in a near-shore country, put all the tongue twisters in today, that gives you probably a lower margin, but with a much quicker lead time, so you can be much more reactive, you can use that source to fill gaps in the supply chain, and it just means that you've got something to sell. Because as a retailer, there's no point having an amazingly huge margin if all that stock at high margin is stuck on a boat somewhere. So balancing your nearshore and your far shore sourcing is a really important tool in managing risk. And then cross-costing between factories. So as you kind of do with most things in life, it's quite unusual that you just get one cost from one place. And unless the product is super, super unique, you should be able to find a couple of options on where to source it from. The main thing when you're cross-costing is to be really clear on your brief. You really need each person costing your product to be costing for the same thing. Otherwise, you might assume something's cheaper, but it's just because you haven't been crystal clear and one person's factored in a higher level of finish than another. So really think about a brief when you're cross-costing that details all your requirements and make sure that you can get some really accurate costs between factories. Then something else to kind of consider in your costings and margins is container fills. So shipping rates are a bugbear of everyone's. They seem to be going up dramatically again. So really optimizing how you fill a container will help you achieve the best pricing. So understanding how your item is packed, how well and efficiently you can fit as much as possible into a container, but also work with factories and talk to them about how they manage loose container loading. So can they combine your stock with someone else they're working with to fill a container? What size of containers are available, and really think about that element that could, at the end of the process, suddenly throw your margin out because you spent loads on shipping it because you've only filled half a container and you could have filled it all. Then exchange rates. So it's always best to pay in the traded currency of the region you're working with. Predominantly that can often be with far shore countries, US dollars, and then things like euros closer to home. And therefore, again, having an understanding of what's happening in the currency markets and whether you can consider hedging currency could really help your profitability. As we all know, kind of when you're buying currency for your holiday, these rates fluctuate up and down all the time, and making sure you factored in what your rate's going to be is really key. And then QC, so quality control. It's really essential because this is where often it goes wrong and they lose money when the quality control hasn't been managed properly. And this is applicable if it comes from, 50 miles away in the UK to 500 miles away in a further afield country, because if the product arrives with you and it's not right, it's always more costly and challenging to deal with at that point. You need to be sure before the product leaves the factory that it's what you want, it's of the right standard, and you're not going to have issues when you arrive. So the ways of managing this, most people would use a sealing process. So if you hear the terminology such as red seals and gold seals or production samples, it's about making sure during the process for both you and the manufacturer or supplier that you're producing exactly what you want. So you get a chance to feedback, adjust the specs, if anything's kind of worrying you. It's a really important part of the process. And it's also, again, when you should be carrying out any testing. So if you've got any legislation that you need the product to be applicable for, make sure it's all being done at the stages before it reaches you. Because as I say, it's the worst thing. If something's shipped for 4 to 6 weeks and it gets here and it's all wrong, it's just the hardest thing probably in a sourcing journey to deal with, to put that right. And fundamentally, kind of the thing that underpins all of those is effective communication. I think this can kind of always feel a bit more challenging, especially over longer distances and time zones. So this is really, again, in preparation and planning, we'd always advocate the use of a critical path. So whether you kind of have it as a handwritten document or the most colour-coded pivoted table spreadsheet known to man, something that's clear for everyone working on a project to see important dates, important milestones. So you all need to know when things need to be done by. You've always got something to refer back to that you've all agreed to, and it will help make the journey follow through quicker. So again, it's kind of just making sure you're planning, you're preparing, and everything should go as you expect it to. But in the planning and preparation side of things, quite often people don't think about making an exit plan. So when you're starting to source yourself, it's really understanding what the end of the product's life cycle is, especially if it doesn't prove to be a great seller for you. So this is where kind of, again, thinking in advance about whether your intake margin is good enough to support a markdown and still remain profitable. So for some retailers, when they source, especially in fast source, their margins will be that high that they can mark down the product, say, between 30 to 50%, and it still can be a profitable line for them. So again, thinking about what happens at that end of life point. When is the end of life point? So do you want that product to be in your company, in your shop, in your brand for 6 months, 12 months, will allow you to kind of work out what end of life looks like. If a further discount than 30 to 50% is needed, it was unlikely that the product was going to sell anyway, so actually you just probably have to take that one at a loss. So don't kind of start thinking that, you've got to be still profitable at lower percentages, but thinking about what works for your customers in terms of a sales discount will help you understand that. And then if you try and cancel out of stock with factories, what are the implications? So you kind of don't want to get to this point, but things do happen. So perhaps kind of previous season stock, you've got too much, something's changed, you don't need the products anymore. And again, this is kind of where the effective communication comes into place. So is it even possible? So that should be where the conversation starts. And that ideally probably is at the very start of the process when you're kind of getting to meet a new supplier, talking to them about what are the possibilities, at what point is it too late to cancel, what are the different options. And if a cancellation is agreed, make sure you're really clear on the implications of it or what might happen. So even if the stock's is not already produced, do all the raw materials exist? Might they just be dumped? Might they kind of go into landfill, which, if you're not fully aware, is not necessarily going to be something that you're happy about. If the product's going to be produced, could it be sold on to someone else? You might agree that that's what you want, but especially if it's got any design IP or it's got your branding or logo on, to suddenly see it turning up somewhere else will be a complete nightmare. But if you're not clear and you're not open about that not being an option, in all fairness, a manufacturer or producer might think, well, they don't want it and they're not bothered, so I need to make some money out of it and I'll sell it on elsewhere. And then if you need to buy more, is that even possible? So again, all part of the conversation and the planning. And this goes back to kind of thinking about near source and far source sourcing, especially if you're looking at seasonal items. So it might be that the big bulk of your stock for Christmas you've sourced from far shore, it comes in, and then you've literally got, something like 12 weeks of sales before Christmas, for instance, and it's sold out really quickly. Well, your lead time with far shore might not mean you can get that back in stock again, but if you've looked at near shore options, you might be able to get some top up in. Or is it even just that once you've produced some, the supplier can do a really quick turnaround and you might choose to air freight it over sea freight? So again, understanding what your options are to optimize the best out of your sourcing, because it's great, we'd always say celebrate sell through, so it's not the end of the world if everything you order sells really quickly, but it's even better if you can make more out of it and kind of build on the momentum you've got. And then there are a myriad of other things to consider when sourcing that are kind of going to rattle through, but just kind of give you some pointers and thoughts to think about. So regional nuances. Many of the sourcing countries are vast, and therefore kind of practices will really vary from area to area. So never make assumptions on previous experiences. So for instance, if you've dealt with a factory or manufacturer in part of a bigger country like China or India in one region, it doesn't necessarily mean it will work the same elsewhere. And then kind of tied into regional nuances are national and religious holidays, because generally they're quite different from what might happen in this country. So quite often things like Chinese New Year, for instance, will have a big impact if you're shipping in the first half of the year, or areas where other religions are followed, factory closures and things will happen. And then even in kind of some of the areas of Europe, August is a key closure month where holidays will be had. So again, the visibility of that and building them into your critical path, because you won't get the stock when you want it if you've not realised these closures are going to happen. And then just a simple on cultural variations. Just because something's how we do it or how we behave in this country, it doesn't apply to different continents. So you've really got to be respectful of different cultures and get to know and understand how your partner businesses operate and how things are done in different countries. And again, ties into language barriers. So we're ultimately hugely lucky that English is such a commonly spoken language across the globe. But again, never assume this will be the case, and be keenly aware that things might get lost in translation. So again, accurate recording of things, clear briefs, clear critical paths will really help, because you might need to use that at some point. Freight forwarders, so these are the guys that can help you with shipping, especially if it's kind of, again, something completely new to you. Working out who you're going to ship your products with is a really important consideration. You don't want the factory to be like, right, your product's ready and you don't really know what to do with it. Understanding the different freight forwarders and the different Incoterms used for shipping goods are really relevant and is a critical part of your research. So Incoterms are a devil's world of three-letter acronyms, everything from FOB to DDP. It's really just generally about who's paying for what at which part of the process. So FOB stands for freight on board, or DDP is delivered duty paid. So once you start to know what they mean, they kind of have a relevance. But again, being really clear on what your pricing is and how you're working with your supplier is key, because if you're thinking they're delivering duty paid but they're thinking they're not, suddenly there's a great big duty bill to be paid when the stock arrives in the country. And kind of on the point of duties, free trade agreements are really worth understanding and keeping an eye out. So we're in quite a crazy year of lots of government elections in lots of different countries. And as a country in the UK, we're kind of still coming out of the other side of Brexit and what that means in terms of trade agreements. But understanding the countries where you might be able to source from without tariffs or without duties can really make a difference in your sourcing. And keeping an eye out for things that are in place, such as anti-dumping legislation, where again, a percentage uplift will be applied to your costs because that's the deal the country has with us. Then legal and regulatory requirements. Sorry, I didn't put my teeth in this morning. So again, don't fall foul of the law. It feels like something obvious, but always take time to understand the regulations that relate to your product categories. Sometimes there are things you wouldn't expect, but they are kind of generally more related to products when you're dealing with something that relates to children and babies, for instance, as you would expect. But just make sure you're really clear. Probably laboured the point about critical paths, but it's on here again. If you do nothing else whilst you're sourcing, kind of start to learn and build a critical path. It will be kind of your Bible. It's really essential, and it kind of helps if you're just not in the business that day, someone else can look at your critical path and go, okay, we're meant to be here, we're expecting a sample to approve there, or it should have shipped by now. It kind of gives everyone a clear view on what's happening. Travel visas, again, it's kind of amazing to go and see your production facilities in real life, but actually some people do get caught out by a lot of the far shore countries especially need travel visas, and again, getting those in advance is a massive part of your planning and can take a lot of time and resource. Sustainability, so again, have you explored or considered the sustainability elements of your production choices? So it can feel really hard when you're not close to the production or you haven't got kind of eyes on what's happening. But quite often, some of the fast source factories are making really great choices, so such as using energy from solar panels on the factory roof. But you've also got to consider sustainability of all parts of the process. So when they're sourcing your raw materials, where are they coming from? Are they from sustainable sources? Do you need any level of accreditation to be sure? Because you really want to be clear you're not affecting the environment or wildlife. Audits. So audits and testing you might require, again, should be part of the early conversation. And we're really lucky at Source, Home and Gift to kind of have a really high level of auditing that's already done with vendors and suppliers here. So you've got a level of reassurance that the team have already done a lot of that work for you. But it can be anything from kind of SEDEX audits to SMETA. There are different brands, different awareness. But again, it's about having those conversations, opening up the kind of platform to talk about what a factory might be doing. And if all of this is massively like you're thinking, oh God, I really don't know where to start, there's so many considerations, Agents can be a really great option. So you've got agents on the ground in a lot of countries. You've got kind of big sourcing agents that can help you from A to Z. And if managing all the different elements of sourcing from QC to shipping, you just don't have enough time for, it's those elements where sourcing agents can become really helpful. So for a percentage of the order cost or a set fee, they'll manage everything for you and often be on the ground in the country of origin, which can be a massive reassurance to a lot of people. So again, it's kind of thinking about how your costings work and what's most important for you. So as I say, kind of we're really going to rattle through kind of sourcing today. It's really a top line kind of view of what things to think about, where to go to. Myself and Anna on the Source Content Hub have done a lot more intelligence sessions around talking in more detail about different countries and the different types of things you might be able to source there. So there's loads more content if you need to find it on the Source website, which again, if you're kind of thinking in the early stages, are really worth a listen and kind of start to get your head into what happens where. But yeah, if there are any questions I can help with now, or once I'm off stage, I'm happy to stick around and kind of chat to people as needed. But is there anything? Oh, there's a lady here. Oh, I think there's a mic coming.
How easy is it to find an agent, and where would you recommend looking for an agent?
So sometimes the factories or producers might have someone they're used to working with that they can recommend. There are some bigger companies, so there are people like Kalara, who are one that specialise in sourcing from the sort of areas like India, who are backed by much bigger companies and have relationships with shippers like Maersk and the like. But again, I kind of advocate the peer-to-peer talking. So again, platforms like LinkedIn, etc., putting it out there, kind of who you're looking for and getting recommendations from other people. Generally, people are maybe more open than you kind of expect, because actually, if their agent is good and they're busy, they'll, it works in everyone's favour if someone's kind of has more work to be doing than just kind of focused on one person and not kind of filling their hours, filling their days.
And the other question I have is, what about on the ground outsourced QC?
Yeah, again, that I would probably say that's probably one that worries people more because QC is so important. I try and find something that ties to an agent rather than someone kind of just doing QC on their own, because there are kind of problems in some territories around kind of backhand payments and kind of things getting through that really shouldn't have got through. So again, kind of I'd look for recommendations or use larger countries. Or, the luxury is if you can go and see something in production yourself. But the reality is that's not always going to be possible.
And then final question. Going with one of the companies that are here at Source Home and Gift, you mentioned something about that you had done they do due diligence. I tried a few times emailing Source about this, and nobody ever emailed me back about it.
So in terms of kind of everyone you'll find in this hall, they are audited to make sure, they're hitting as far as anyone can be aware. So you kind of have to say that with audits, kind of it's as good as you get in terms of their work standards are right, their sustainability is right, and things like, it's a scary thing to do to think that someone's going to take your money and what they might do with it.
Yeah, because you're sending the money before in advance and paying the deposit well in advance.
Yeah.
But they are legitimate companies that are taking your money.
That is what the team here have really gone to ensure. And a lot of the guys here also come through on government funding and part of wider sourcing groups. So if anything, I think I'd feel surer in this space, in this room, that the people you're working with as a starting point will be fine. So yeah, you've got me on camera saying that. So I'll take it up with Suze if not.